Your Creative Push, episode 332.
Because storytelling is such a powerful thing. Once people feel like they've told their story, it can lift so much weight off of their soul.
Welcome to Your Creative Push, the podcast that pushes you to pursue your creative passions. I'm your host, Youngman Brown, and my guest today is Daniel Robinson. Daniel is a writer for the hit television show How to Get Away with Murder, and he's also just published his debut novel, First They Ignore You. And Daniel comes on the show today to talk about the differences between those two writing processes, of writing with a team of writers for a television show versus writing in the solitary confinement of your own brain. He also talks about how the skills of a basketball player translates to the creative realm, and seeing things done at a professional level and what that did for his mindset. He also talks about embracing failure and being a mercenary with your own creative skills. He also shares the way in which he pushed to dig deeper and how he put himself on the page via dialogue between his characters. And finally, Daniel talks about calibrating his own sensitivity and turning it into a tool, and why you and all other artists need to guard your attention and how to deal with distractions. This was a real fun conversation for me as a writer to pick the brain of somebody who has worked with many different forms of writing, but this is an episode that will definitely translate well for anybody in any creative pursuit that is trying to put themselves out there and to explore their own psyche. So please give it up for my friend, Daniel Robinson. Daniel, welcome to Your Creative Push.
Thank you so much for having me here.
No, thanks for being here. The only other writer for television that we've had is actually your buddy that connected the two of us. So I am really excited to talk about your writing for television, but also talking about your first novel, which you sent me some select chapters of, which I was really impressed by, and can't wait to read the full thing. So,
awesome.
Yeah, welcome, and I can't wait to get into this.
Okay, great. Yeah, let's do it.
I always like to give my guests the opportunity at the start to sort of give us a brief overview, sort of how you got to the point you are today in your career and your creative life.
Career-wise, it's a simple story. It's complex, but it's simple in that, it took me 10 years from the time I moved out to Los Angeles to pursue a career as a screenwriter, and initially doing so, looking to work in feature films, but then seeing that there was a lot more work and my day job sort of moving me into the television world. It was about 10 years of being pretty much every kind of assistant you can imagine. I was an agent's assistant, a manager's assistant, producer's assistant, director's assistant, writer's assistant, and there's two subdivisions of that specific job where you can be an assistant to a writer, or there's an actual job out here called a writer's assistant where you're in the room on a TV show with all of the writers taking notes, and maybe you get to pitch a little bit or write a few scenes here and there, and that's sort of considered an entryway into becoming an actual staff writer, and that is how I eventually got in. So it was about 10 years of getting a lot of kale salads, answering phones, setting meetings, reading scripts, giving notes. That was sort of the utilitarian way that I kind of was able to break in. And then also during that decade, intensively working on my own craft, writing a lot, getting as much feedback as I could, and it growing, as my own creative person.
Right. Now, as you're doing like all these kind of assistant jobs and trying to break your way in, you said you're doing your own writing. Were you writing for television, or were you writing novel, or were you writing just kind of whatever came to your mind?
The novel was definitely the last thing. That's the most recent. So nothing like that earlier on. I definitely came out, like I said, wanting to work in features. I had gone to film school, and that's what I wanted to focus on. That's what I had fallen in love with initially. So I wrote a lot of features, but then I ended up getting a job at an agency, a talent agency as an assistant. It was the Gersh agency, which is kind of like a mid-major. It's a little bit smaller than the big four, but still fairly large. And it was in the TV department for a TV agent, but it was literary. She represented writers. And so it felt like a step closer because I had come out here with no connections. And I saw how much work there was in television. if you think about every movie, and that nowadays the big high budget feature films you see released, they might have 2 or 3 writers credited. There's probably like 3 or 4 other writers uncredited who did passes on those. But really, when you think of a feature film, you think of one writer. And when it came to TV, they had staffs of 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 15 writers. And there's a lot more shows that get made every year, especially now, than movies. So there was just a lot more work in television. I had to read a lot of TV scripts in that job. So I started working a lot on TV scripts at that time as well. But I've also never been the most focused. People would often say initially, you should really try to brand yourself. Like, are you going to be a half-hour sitcom or an hour drama person? Are you going to be feature film? Or are you going to be TV? Within those, there are even subheadings. Are you going to do procedurals? Are you going to do soap operas if you're doing an hour? Are you going to do, traditional multicam sitcoms? Are you going to do more single cam stuff? So I was never that good at honing in on one thing, because I would kind of fall in love with ideas, and the idea would dictate the form to me. Like, if I had an idea for something, I would think, oh, this feels like it's a half-hour single cam, or this feels like it's an hour drama. And so I kind of would just go from project to project, writing a lot of different things.
So take us into your mindset, like, as you're doing a whole bunch of different things. I definitely relate to you, and I know a lot of people will relate to you about wanting to do kind of everything and try your hand at everything. What was it then that you focused in on that you found success with? And also why? Like, why did it end up becoming a success?
So this might seem like a little bit of a tangent.
Go for it. We love tangents.
Right. It's different for everybody. It's whatever works, really. And for me, I think it was the game of basketball. And so I'm not great at basketball, right? But I love the game. And I didn't start playing it till I had moved out here when I was probably around 26, simply for the fact that, I had no money and I had a lot of free time on the weekends. And when you're working on TV shows, you get something called hiatus, which is where, the show doesn't take a full year to produce. It might be 15 episodes, 10 episodes. And the show I was on went on hiatus. So you're not getting paid, right? You're waiting like 1 month, 2 months, sometimes 3 months for the show to come back. So you have to live very, very cheaply. And I had a friend of mine who was out here doing a similar thing, crashing on my couch, and we had a basketball. And we just went out to shoot some hoops because it was free and it was something we could do together. And we were both terrible, but because I was a little taller than him, I was a little bit better, right? Because I could at least get the rebounds and put the ball back up. And so I was like, maybe I could play basketball. Maybe this can be a thing I can do. It won't cost me any money, so that's good. It's healthy. And, I just kind of fell in love with that game while I was working all these assistant jobs and working on my own craft. And from that game, I realized how many different skill sets are necessary to kind of come together to produce what looks like a seamless performance. And what I mean by that is you might see a guy on the court who shows up and he's hitting all his 3-pointers, he's dribbling, he's penetrating, he's getting to the hoop, he's playing tremendous defense, he's passing for the assist. And each one of those things, I realized that's like a learnable skill that you can isolate and drill into yourself. And then once you master each one of those, or increasingly as you master them one after the other, you put them together, and that creates the overall performance. And so I knew I was kind of wafting all over the place with my writing, but I thought, you know what? Okay, I know I've got a strong voice. That's like my starting place. It's like if I was a big guy, I could play down low by the rim and maybe play some defense, get some layups. So I was like, okay, I have good character voices, but I really need to work on my structure. I need to work on my understanding of the different types of genres. I need to work on incorporating different sorts of styles into what I'm doing, because I was writing maybe more dry, more intellectually to begin with, and it wasn't as emotionally compelling as it should have been. And also, I need to be better at receiving notes from other people and not getting so defensive and sort of shutting down or pushing back. And then also, I need to be better at giving notes. I need to read more people's stuff and give them better notes, because that will enhance my abilities just on a selfish level in being able to give notes to myself. But those are all skill sets that you need, or I felt like I needed, to be a complete writer. And so it's not like it changed that much what I was doing, because I still did go from project to project, but with that perspective in place of knowing that I'm trying to build complementary skill sets that can incorporate into the whole, I feel like that mentality shift helped me focus in on the craft of writing. And I don't want to answer 2 questions out at once here, or give you 2 separate answers. But there was another time when I was working on a show called Party Down. and it was on Stars. It's a half-hour sitcom about cater waiters with like Adam Scott and Lizzie Kaplan and
I
Jane Lynch.
remember that show.
That's what everybody says when you mention Portia Down.
Yeah, it sounded familiar, but yes, now I remember that show. Sorry.
So that was like my sort of like, if you imagine your career as like this big castle wall that you're trying to penetrate, and you can like hear the party going on inside, and you're just trying to get onto the other side of that wall so you can be part of the party.
Sure.
It's like the doors opened and I saw inside, because I was an assistant to a writer. So there was really only one writer on the show. Well, there was two, but one who was there every day. And his name was John Enbaum. And I worked for him. And he was like such a nice person to work for and so incredibly talented. And I saw how much work he was putting into his craft. Like, this was a guy who already had his own show. It was an amazing show, like that I had joy in working on it, but I also had so much respect for the show that we were doing. I just loved the show. And so I saw how much work he was doing, and that there was a process to it. He would come up with the initial story areas, or even before that, they would talk about the seasonal arcs for each character, right? And they'd put them up on a big diagram, and they'd diagram out, this is where Martin Starr's character is going to go in episode 1 and then 2 and then 3, so that by episode 10, he's here. This will be his season-long journey. We're going to break it up episode by episode. And then they would do story areas for the individual episodes, and then outlines for those. And in TV, there's a real quality control process. Sometimes it can become a process that diminishes creativity, but sometimes it can enhance it. But there's a lot of feedback that you're getting. When you would do your first draft of a story area, which is like a 2 to 5 page document with an overview of the major arcs and the things that are going to happen in that episode, that would go to the other producers. They would give their notes. Then you do a revision. Then that goes to the studio. They do their notes. Then there's a revision. That goes to the network. Then they get their notes in. Then you do more revisions, right? And for every step, so story area, outline, and then episode. So you're looking at revising, the basic structure or content of that episode. What is that, like 9 times minimum before it's going to get shot? And you're continually revising it along the way. So I was working for these pros for the first time, sort of seeing into that castle. And I'm like, wow, I'm already behind them in career. They're better than me at what they're doing, and they're working harder, and they're more organized than I am. Mm-hmm. So if I want to get on their level, if I want to get to where they are, I need to be not just working as hard as them, but even harder. I need to be just as organized as they are. I need to incorporate those steps into what I'm doing, just like they're doing. I was lucky to have that workplace experience around professionals, and then to have the wisdom at that time to really humble myself and say, you're not ready yet. There's a reason you're not doing what they're doing, but you have this opportunity to learn and to grow and to implement this knowledge into your own career now.
And was that like I don't want to say like a slap in the face, but like a jolt, that it's like kind of almost overwhelming to see the amount of work that other people are putting in, and seeing how much more time you have to do. Maybe you don't have time to play basketball anymore because you need to be asking other people for notes, reading other people's stuff and making notes for them, learning how to get better at structure or better at kind of emotional intelligence or whatever. Did that almost stop you in your tracks?
And I'd say the vacillations are normal, right? I'm not going to tell you anything different than any other writer. There are peaks and valleys, there are highs and lows. And absolutely, there were many setbacks along the way, some, real and external, and many of them just internal, based on feeling overwhelmed. Absolutely. And if I think back to my first days of even moving out to Los Angeles, there's definitely a culling period where a lot of people initially move out here after film school. And then, year after year, there'd be less and less people who stayed to stick it out because of how difficult it is to break into this. So absolutely, there was a lot of doubt and difficulty. And I think I was just fortunate in that I was consumed by this almost pathological belief or vision, that I could accomplish this. And whenever I would either psych myself out or hit some kind of external roadblock, I would do what I needed to do to process that and get through it and then get back to work. And now at this point in my career, those vacillations are still very normal. But the amount of time has dwindled down, thankfully. Mm-hmm. When I get bad notes, it's gone from like a month of paralysis to like a day of paralysis.
Right.
And again, that comes from basketball, because for me, that's the thing I found that helped put it in context and maybe separate it a little bit from myself as like this intimately personal thing where it's like, or maybe this was Wayne's Gretzky. I don't know who said this. You miss 100% of the shots you don't take, right?
Yeah, Gretzky.
And then I remember reading some quote by Michael Jordan talking about how like he's this epic failure. He's like, I've missed more last second shots than anybody. I've airballed it more than anybody. I've done this more than anybody. And he talked about all the times he's failed. It's probably a Nike commercial or something that got to me. But he wouldn't have been able to do what he did if he didn't embrace those failures as well and accept them as a necessary part of his growth and maturation in his pursuit. And so I tried to have that mentality that like, okay, I'm not just going to fail a little bit. Like I'm going to be the best failure. I'm going to fail constantly. I'm going to write scripts that make no sense to anybody but myself. And then I'll get notes and then I'll try to make them better. And then I'll mess that up again. And then I'll try again. And then, I'll miss this opportunity, but I'll find the next one. So for me, it was really about perspective. And then not having any other option. Like I came out here right after college to do this. And like I said, it took me 10 years. And near the end of that, before I got the chance to go work on the show I work on now, How to Get Away with Murder, I was definitely contemplating what am I going to do? Because it's been a decade and, I haven't cracked through this thing yet. And I feel like I have given it everything I've got. I don't know if I can keep doing this. How much longer can I keep doing this? What's a reasonable assessment of that? Luckily, I didn't have to make that decision, but I was getting to that place right before I was finally able to get a working job as a writer.
Right. I want to get into that. I want to get into How to Get Away with Murder and also your book. But it has to be noted that you're so right. And there's so many correlations to athletics and sports. And especially when you think of, professional athletes, we always think, oh, I'm never going to reach that level of LeBron James or whoever it may be. And of course there are physical limitations that not like,
right.
I can't become LeBron James. Like I can't become like a defensive end in the NFL. Like I'm just not built for that. But the correlation still exists, and it's still very accurate. And it's like it's the same for like artists or writers that have made it. And like you look at people on Instagram, for example, and they have a ton of followers and everything they post is perfect. And we relate to them or we compare ourselves to them with our worst moments, our dark moments compared to their best moments, and they're only sharing their best moments. But also, if they've reached this great level of talent or they can create art with ease, it's from all of those hours where nobody's watching and all of those dark moments that they have encountered during their pursuit of greatness, or all those hours in the gym shooting free throws over and over again with nobody watching, nobody even getting your own rebounds. It's like we don't think about those things when we're sitting there failing or having a dark moment ourselves. And it's so important to remember that in order to get to greatness, to get to the point we want to get to, it's going to require practice. It's going to require dark moments, and it's going to require 5, 6, 7 revisions before it's exactly the way we want it to be,
At 100%. I wish that everybody, especially people who want to pursue something like this, and by the way, I think you're doing such a wonderful service with this podcast, and I loved all the messages I heard from the various episodes.
Thanks, man.
I wish I'd been listening to it. It would have saved me some grief. Anyway, but it's all a blessing, right? Because they're all opportunities to learn.
Sure.
But it's exactly what you said. And I wish that everybody had the opportunity to kind of go behind the curtain, see the great and powerful Oz and see how much work it takes. Like, an episode of our show, there's 10 writers working on it. There's I think we have 3 or 4 other producers who are working in the production, plus the entire cast. Everybody who's doing anything on our show is like an expert of their craft, right? Everyone's really good at their job. Every department had hair, makeup, wardrobe, lighting, sets, camera, like it's all pros, right? So every second you're seeing of a TV show like ours, when it's working right, it's a harmony of hundreds of years of people perfecting all of the different types of crafts that humans have endeavored to learn about, really. And putting that together to make this moment, and ideally we're after truthful moments, we're trying to represent the truth. But you have to know that that moment that you're watching is a complete lie. It's a complete deception. And it only works because so many people are coming together who are experts, and that it took such a long time, so many meetings, revisions, changes, questions, mistakes. Hopefully you catch them in time. And then in post-production, you go through that all over again, only now you're more limited in the choices you can make. So, nothing comes out perfect. All those moments that we see on a screen, you can look at them, as goals or as lessons or something like that, but you can't put too much stock into them. You can't look at them as an actual reflection of reality. And seeing behind that has helped me because I saw how much work it took to get into something that I wanted to do, but also has helped me personally to be like, don't compare yourself to the finished product. If that's where you want to go, great. But now get in the gym or get on your computer and do the work that got that person there.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's funny too, because on one hand, I think you're right. It's to see behind the curtain, to see how much work goes in can sometimes, I guess that's why I asked you that question. Like, did it paralyze you? Did it stop you in your tracks? But sometimes ignorance is way better. It's like good to go into something without knowing how much work it's going to take, because like you progressively learn the things that you need to learn along the way to eventually get to that point. But then looking back, it's like, holy shit, if I had known back then, I would have never gotten into this. And sometimes it's better to kind of leap before you look,
100%. I mean, that's the blessing of youth, I think. It's just the unbelievable naivete and arrogance. Like, I really thought after film school, I was going to drive down the 101 and they were going to hand me an overall deal and be like, you're the next Steven Spielberg. So I'm glad I had that mentality, right? If I knew everything that I was about to encounter, it would have made the decision much harder and scarier. So I'm glad that I had that youthful naivete and that I didn't know what was ahead of me for the next 10 years. I feel like that really was a blessing.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I wanted to get into How to Get Away with Murder and then how that compares to writing your novel. What is it? What's it like working for a team, with a team of people? Like, does that take the pressure off of you in a way, or does it add more pressure to you? And then, especially in comparison to writing for yourself, where you're basically on your own.
So on a TV show, or at least in my experience, there's a job called a showrunner, and that's usually the person who wrote the first episode of the series, and they kind of have absolute power. And so my boss, who created the show, his name's Pete Nowak, and he's the guy who obviously gave me my shot. I'm very grateful to for helping establish my career. It's kind of all dependent on what he wants. He'll come in and say, it's your episode. I want this character to order some orange juice. I want this character to, kiss that character, whatever. And so you just kind of develop that stuff out with all the writers in the room. And when it's your episode, you're in charge of leading the discussion. And so it is really nice because when the process is really working, it's like jazz to me or like basketball, where there's not one set path you have to walk, but because all of you have studied the game of writing, you all know the rules. And so you can sort of free form riff together and build story out very quickly. And I think that's kind of the reason that TV writers' rooms were set up this way, because, once they bring the crew together and they've rented the stages and they've rented the equipment and they're paying the actors and actors, when they're in first position on a show, that means they can't take other work. So you're paying them for their time, whether you're using them or not for that period of filming. So there's a lot of expense to making a TV show. And as a result of that, you want to shoot it all as condensed as possible. So you're renting all that equipment in the stages and paying for the actors and all the other crew for the shortest duration as possible. So once you start filming, you don't want to stop. It's like you're running down a tunnel, and the train's right behind you and you're just laying track. So without a large staff, it would be impossible for one person or even two people to continually put together the episodes like that. So it's really a necessity in that regard because of the financial constraints and the time constraints. And like I said, it can be really, really exhilarating. Like, as a writer, it wasn't something I ever thought about initially. My career path was always very egocentric in like, how am I going to get to where I want to be and do what I want to do? And then along the way now, I've realized how much I love teamwork because it's harmonizing, it's making something better from the sum total of its parts, and everybody bringing their strengths to the table and trusting each other and knowing each other and knowing how to, on the fly, in an improvisational way, but also very much grounded in your craft, hear what someone's saying, maybe give them a note. I like that part, but I think we have to worry because last episode we did this, but we wanted to get here. So maybe we take this part and combine it with that other pitch. And then someone else jumps in like, oh, yeah. And then we can use that pitch that we talked about yesterday and put it with this pitch. And then a new person's like, oh, and I just read this article about how in the criminal justice system, they're doing this, this, and this. And all of a sudden, you have these beautiful moments and you're telling story and you've all done it together. That is really nice. And it absolutely is supportive. And especially if you have a bad day, you feel like your pitches aren't going well. A good batting average in a TV writer's room is like 30%, 40% of your ideas land. So again, all that failing that I did early on is very helpful because, and my showrunner has told me, don't worry about if your pitches land or not. That's not what you're there to worry about. Like, I just need you to keep coming up with ideas. And if I don't like something, don't be discouraged and keep going. So absolutely, if you feel like you're having a bad day and you're just not getting where the story is going and you feel like your pitches are falling flat, then there's other people there to pick up the work and keep it moving and to pick you up too and remind you, don't worry about it. Yesterday I was the one who felt like I couldn't do anything and you came up with that great pitch. So that was helpful. And by the end, there's so much collaboration going on. At first, initially as a staff writer, I think, and they talk about this in the WJ staff writer bootcamp, when you join the union, you'll kind of be keeping track of all your pitches. Like, oh, I landed that one today. I landed this one yesterday. And they're like, don't worry about that because nobody else is doing that. Nobody else cares as much about you as you do. And it's so true. And now at this point, because I've been writing on the show, this is my third year, I'm like, someone's like, oh, that was a great pitch you had today. I'm like, what pitch? Oh, yeah. Did I say that? Like, you just forget because you're just in the moment doing the work and you're not trying to keep count. So the episode just becomes kind of like, the analogy I use is like it's our child, right? All of us together have birthed this thing that didn't exist before. And my coworkers are all really amazing people too. So, so that makes it easy to really love that aspect of working together. Now, when it's not going well, obviously it could be its own beast, right? And it can be hard because you're dealing with lots of different people who maybe are having competing visions or whatever the problem is that particular day or that particular episode or storyline. There's a real talent to, team management and making sure everything is harmonizing. And so sometimes you have to figure out other ways if the room is not working to figure out what is it about our dynamic right now where we're not achieving our goals. And it might not even be about pitching. It might be just you need to have a conversation with someone as a friend next time you guys take a break because, we take breaks like every 2 hours or something. And then they're going to come back in and turn it all around. You don't know. And then on my own, when I was writing the novel, which took me like, I think 2 years just to get the first draft done, it was a very different experience because what happens when you're at work is, like I said, you're servicing someone else's vision. And so this skill that you've cultivated for a very long time, you're a mercenary. You've sold that off to somebody because they're now giving your career some legitimacy. They're helping you move up and they're also paying you a good salary. So you're giving that skill that you've cultivated to someone else's vision. And however much you can align it with your own is a benefit, but it's not going to always happen at a high level. And so the book then because I noticed like something felt off for me after the first year that I was fully staffed on the show because I'd lost that thing that had been kind of my coping mechanism for life, which was just my writing. It was the way I would process my reality. And it's the same thing you hear in like every VH1 Behind the Music, where it's like we were the garage band, we were doing our own thing, and then we got big, and then we felt we were corporate, and we lost that thing that made us special in the first place. I did go through some semblance of that, where I was like, oh man, Daniel, maybe you really are like an artist. You're sensitive about this. This is important to you. This isn't just a trick you've learned. It's not a skill. This has a deep personal meaning for you and how you process your reality. And so that helped inform the process with the book, where it became like everything that I wasn't doing in my day job, which was just being self-directed and honoring my internal thoughts and monologue. That's what I could do, on nights and weekends with my own writing, with the novel. So very different processes, almost like yin and yang.
Right. I can definitely relate because I am looking for a career change right now, and I'm actually applying to different writing jobs. And as I'm doing the applications, and sometimes they, you get a test for like, do these 10 sentences and tell like what is grammatically incorrect in them. And I'm like, man, I love writing for myself, but I think
Mhm.
I would die writing for a company or like doing something like that. So I can definitely relate to that and how necessary, like, and I'm sure everybody listening can relate, like how necessary, even if you do get a job that's somewhat related to what you're good at, like your natural abilities at whatever it may be, and you are serving somebody else's vision or doing something for another company, it is like you still need to find a way to get to the thing that is inside of you that needs to come out.
100%. I mean, that's why I love this podcast, because I personally believe that there's not a person out there with a boring story. Like, I really am continually fascinated by people, by everybody. And the only people I don't like are the people that I haven't met yet, you know? And once I've gotten to
Mm-hmm.
know anybody, I find all of them interesting, and there's always a story there. And I don't mean like that's my thing, right? A written narrative story, but whether that story comes out in art, in visual art, sculpture. I listened to one where you had like a domino artist on here, and that
Yeah.
sounded amazing.
Mm-hmm.
But I think all of us have a story to tell, because as many people as there each one of us has a unique perspective and a unique upbringing, and maybe there are similarities that link us all together, which is a very good thing. But I do think all of those stories are really important to tell. Um, and I think you have to have that belief if you want to be in this business, right? You can't really. I don't think it's sustainable to have the egocentric viewpoint of like, my story is the most important and only I really understand life. So absolutely, I think everybody needs to have that outlet for expressing their perspective and their experiences, because storytelling is such a powerful thing. Once people feel like they've told their story, it can lift so much weight off of their soul. And it has for my life. And we can get to that when we talk more about the book and this insane, neurotic, anxiety ridden character that I wrote about. But yeah, I think that's really important for everybody.
Yeah, that was gonna be my next question. Please do get into your book, First They Ignore You. Where did the inspiration for Russell come from? He's the main character. And maybe set the scene for the listeners about what this book is about, and then why it's important to you.
This is it's a fictional book. It's comedy, and it takes place all in a weekend. And it's basically an addiction story, kind of a rock bottoming story where somebody hits rock bottom. Only the addict in the story happens to have a binge eating disorder, and he's addicted to fast food. He's also depressed and has a lot of anxiety issues. And it's the weekend in his life when everybody realizes he's been hiding this serious problem. And so he rock bottoms as a result of that. And it also takes place in Hollywood. He's a screenwriter. The character for me, Russell, is just kind of like my id unleashed, right? Like amplified and then unleashed into Los Angeles, California, as I knew it around the time I was writing it, like 2016, 2017, what it's really like out here working in this industry. He's kind of like me if I'd had too much career success too early. And so I wasn't prepared for it because I hadn't learned the lessons about life that I needed to beforehand. And he just is collapsing under the pressure that he's perceiving that his life is under now. And he's turning to food as his coping mechanism. And he lives with his girlfriend, so he's sneaking off at night to have these really self-destructive and self-indulgent fast food meals. But it's the signs are starting to add up and the consequences are starting to add up. And there's a dog involved that sets everything into motion.
Yeah. And like I told you before the interview, it's so relatable to so many different ways that people, myself included, have either become addicted to something or have used something as a form of self-sabotage to not get to whatever you're supposed to get to in life. And I think you've really nailed so many different interactions and emotions and settings of things like this, especially that scene with Russell and Jessica in the kitchen when he's making that smoothie in the morning, and he sees her with like loving eyes, and he's approaching her with like this happiness and this love and compassion and stuff, and then she just does one thing to put him on the defensive, where he has to go into that like, oh, I need to protect myself and kind of the addiction that I'm going through, and the focus shouldn't be on me right now. Like, screw you. Like, look at you. And like, that is just something that I think a lot of people could relate to, just like the emotion that you're able to capture. So congratulations to you for being able to capture that. Did you tap into that from like experience or from seeing other people? How did you kind of feed into that?
Well, thank you so much for the kind words. And
Absolutely.
it's tough because I want to make it clear that this is absolutely a work of fiction.
Mm-hmm.
And the funny thing about that scene is my girlfriend was reading it because she's doing my final, helping me proof the book before, we put it online to publish it. And she's laughing. And I'm like, what are you laughing about? And she says, well, I'm just reading this fight scene between Russell and Jessica. And I'm just imagining you having this with one of your ex-girlfriends. You guys probably had this fight. And I was like, no, I never had that discussion with anybody I've dated. That Jessica represents me and Russell represents me. And that's a discussion that I've had inside of my head constantly
Oh,
for,
cool.
the last 10 years. Right.
Yeah.
And the real joy for me in this book, and again, I should say, it's hard to say, right? Because I know there are varying levels of addiction. And I will say that I do think I have an unhealthy relationship with sugary foods, fatty foods, processed foods. And I tend to over rely on them to help regulate my emotion during times of stress.
Mm-hmm.
But I was never as bad as Russell. He's like that part of me amplified to the 10th degree, because it's like I was saying earlier, I want to get at human truth, but to do that, I'm willing to use deceptions to get at those human truths. That's what I'm really interested in, right? Is getting to the universality of the human experience. So that conversation was one I'd had inside of myself for a very long time of, you could relate it in so many ways. It could just be about physical appearance, right? And it could just be me shaming myself for thinking that I don't look good enough. I'm not fit enough. No woman's ever going to love me looking the way I look. I should be in the gym much more than I am. I shouldn't be eating the way that I'm eating. Look at all these people you're in competition with, not just for romantic partners, but for jobs as well. And they all look better than you, and they're going to beat you because people like to work with attractive people. So and this idea, this Hollywood idea of like, you need to be out there networking and schmoozing and using your connections to try to get wherever you can get. Like, she kind of represents that. And I felt a little bit bad doing that to her because, you spend so much time with these characters. Ideally, you'd have sympathy for all of them, and they're all fully formed human beings, right? So we're seeing her in the first half of the novel from Russell's perspective, and he is absolutely an addict who has just a tidal wave of shame that he's holding inside. And I think that's what that is. When she says one thing about him, the tiniest crack, and then all of a sudden the flood waters break and all that shame comes rushing out. And that when you're in that state, that vulnerable state. And so that's when defensiveness comes up, right? Because you feel like if I let this person make any criticism of me, it means I'm worthless, I'm a piece of garbage, and nobody's ever going to love me, and I should just crawl into a hole and die. And it's obviously a huge overreaction, but that's how it feels when you're in that raw state and when you're holding in so much shame that you haven't dealt with. And I feel like that's where addiction can insert itself, because we're using other things to cope instead of processing through our emotions and our internal feelings. So it's a lot of different things going on there. But it's just me trying to take the sum total of the things I know and experience to embody them in real, truthful characters who are real people, and then to tell a compelling story, that an audience would want to read through. That a big part of my goal in writing the book was I wanted to write the type of book that I would want to pick up and read. And I tend to like books where I can read through them quickly. The chapters aren't too long. There's not a lot of digression, talking about how beautiful the willow trees are on the pond at night. And we just move through story that is about character and emotional growth. So I think all that went into a moment like that.
Right. And I think that that's like a stellar lesson for people too. We're so, as creative people, we're often so like focused on like the pleasing everybody and writing something that would appeal to everyone. And like, honestly, like when I first started reading it, I was like, oh, am I really going to be interested in reading about somebody who eats too much? that's not somebody that I would relate to normally, or somebody that I would think that I would relate to. But like I said, so many of the aspects of Russell's personality, and really all the characters' personalities, you can relate to. I can relate to very, very well, and that made it like just like the quickest read from all the guests that I've had that have had books and stuff like that. It was the quickest read where I didn't want it to end. You know what I mean? Like it wasn't just like, oh, I need to read this to prepare for the interview. And by the way, that's not to say anything disparaging to any of my previous guests, but many of them have had very long books, and I have very little time
Right.
before the interview. But anyway,
I get it.
I'm just saying, like, that's such a lesson for people that if you can put your own truth out there in whatever way, maybe you have to split it into two characters, people will relate to it. The right audience will find it, and the right audience won't be able to put it down or stop looking at it or stop listening to it, whatever it may be. You just have to like insert as much of your own truth in there as possible. It doesn't have to be autobiographical. It doesn't have to be like, hey, this is what I, Daniel Robinson, have gone through. Like
Hmm.
you can find artistic ways to implement those truths into your work, but it's just trying to dig down as deep as you possibly can to creatively find ways to do so.
Absolutely. And I want to only make one more point on what you said, because I don't want to give myself any excess credit. I was really, really lucky to work with an editor. Her name is Benet Nauer. When I gave her the original manuscript, I think it was twice the length of what it is now. It was so bloated, and I had not really figured out, I didn't know how to write a book yet. I was figuring it out as I wrote this novel. And she went through page by page, chapter by chapter with me. And we did revision after revision after revision of each chapter until we were both satisfied with it. And she was a tough critic, but very fair. And I feel like I learned how to write, through her, a novel on this particular project. And like that chapter that we were just talking about, I don't think that even existed in the first draft of the novel that she had gotten. But then as we
Mm.
were getting to that point in the story, I realized that moment needed to happen. And it was just about digging deep and coming at it from different angles until I could figure out what is this really about. And then in my mind, it's essentially a breakup scene where like they almost get to the point of that realization. Then they're interrupted by a little plot twist at the end, which I don't want to reveal as a spoiler. But yeah, it was such a learning process to make the book. And I had to free myself from this like anxiety to get things done and to have it done quickly so I could like use it to attain these career goals that I had. And I had to just say, okay, I'm going to sit with this as long as this person who I really respect and whose opinion I trust is telling me I need to sit with this and to keep attacking it. And then by the end, I feel like, she got the best out of me, which was the most amazing experience to like really have a coach like that to, enhance my game. So yeah, it definitely was not brief initially. And to all the people who read the first like 800-page draft or whatever it was, 400-page draft, like, thank you so much for taking the time, because it was a mess. But you really helped me.
Now, thinking back to that experience, what's like the one or maybe even two like major things that she helped you to realize that you were maybe doing wrong, or like you had the wrong approach in your initial draft? Like what were the main things that you needed to kind of rework or rethink that made it kind of more clear in your head, if that makes sense?
Mm-hmm. Whew, that's tough to remember back to that moment. I know the number one note she would almost always give is go deeper. And it was really about getting to that, like, raw, vulnerable place. And I'm a very sensitive person to begin with, right? I think probably most artists have an innate level of or increased sensitivity over the general population. They're feeling things more, and that's why they need to talk about them more, share their experiences more.
Guilty.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm very sensitive. I didn't even realize this, till I got older. I thought everybody must be this way. But, I would realize, wow, things are really impacting me heavily when they don't seem to be bothering other people half as much. So that sensitivity is a tool that you kind of have to calibrate to make it work for you and not let it overwhelm you. And in the book, Russell is constantly overwhelmed by his sensitivity because he is so worried about everybody calling him out for being an overeater, for being overweight, for not working on his script when he should have been working on it, for being a fraud of a human being, essentially, and unworthy of love, that he's trying throughout the book, because he's very smart, and in really comical ways. I know it sounds severe probably, but I promise there's a ton of humor in it.
Ton.
Of him trying to keep everyone at bay with this sort of mental Olympics he's playing. And it's easy in LA because in LA, you never have to worry about anyone seeing you because all they ever see is themselves. It is a city run on ego. So you can kind of hide in plain sight for a really long time here. And so in him and in unleashing that sensitivity, it kind of helped me calibrate it for myself. This, like, he's almost an embodiment of a voice inside of me that I would actually, when I would go out and try to go on adventures in LA as I was working on the story, I would take him with me and I would say, what does Russell think about this experience? This is what I'm thinking. What's he thinking about this? What's he doing in this moment? How's he afraid of these people? Who's he drawn to in this room? In like giving him life and giving him this story, I was able to calibrate that and to kind of process through that on my own in like a really amazing way. So I think to get back to your question, it was Benet challenging me to like go deeper and like attach myself to each character and the truth of them in those moments to try to make the story work. And that was the challenge, but also the reward for me in that after we went through that process, I really felt in touch with that sensitivity in a very helpful way as a writer and just as a human being.
Right. And Russell's such a great character. I don't want to, I don't always get too into everybody, like the specifics of books, especially for people who haven't read it yet. It comes out tomorrow. But he's just such a perfect example to use of somebody that kind of limits themselves. And he has so many things going on in his own brain. He knows he needs to get to. He needs to get to his physical health. He needs to get to writing. He needs to do all these things. So many things that we can all relate to. And the whole purpose of this podcast, it's like we push off the things that we know we're supposed to do because, watching TV is easier, drinking's easier, eating is easier. It's easier to just forget those things. But actually, like after a long period of time, like a decade, it gets exhausting. It gets exhausting knowing in the back of your head that you're supposed to be doing other things, but you're doing the easy thing. And I think that once you do get to that thing that you're supposed to do, you realize that it's easy once you do get those signals from your brain that, oh, working out is rewarding. Oh, eating healthy is rewarding. Oh, writing is, or painting or doing whatever it is bringing you joy and it's rewarding. Then that thing that seemed like such a grind, the thing that seemed like it would be so exhausting to put in all that time to do those things is easy. It's not exhausting.
Yeah.
The other life is exhausting, but you have to like start down that path of getting better, whether it's in your career or your health or your creativity, to start to see that, like you said before, like to see behind the curtain, to see the other side,
Absolutely. I think, even for myself in like a microcosmic way, if I know, let's say I have a Saturday off with no plans and I'm like, I need to, I got those notes from my friend about the first act of my script. I need to work on that. This is the day I'm going to work on it. And so I'll just open up the notes and open up the file on my computer. It's there. It's ready. And then I'm like, but before I do that, I know I'm going to want to watch this horrible reality show. I'm going to want to play this video game. I want to go to the gym. I want to eat this sandwich, whatever it is, right? And I sort of say, okay, I'm going to just dive into those indulgences and those distractions hard first. Get them out of the way so that they're not even interesting anymore. And because the computer's there now, it's just like it becomes the distraction from the thing I'm doing that I'm getting bored of. And it's all set up and ready to go. And I might walk over there and just work 5 minutes. Now I'm back to my distractions. But then as the day goes on, I'm back for another 10 minutes and then I leave again, And so you can use that psychology in a microcosmic way, not with the abuse of drugs and alcohol, but other things. The distractions are okay. And you can maybe use that to make the work the joyful distraction from the other things. Right.
Yeah, for me, it's once I do the same thing. I'll open up Microsoft Word, start writing a couple words, and then be like, oh, but I you know what? I haven't checked my stats yet on Libsyn to see how many people listen to the podcast. I haven't checked my email ad nauseum. I haven't checked the status of this or whatever. And that leads me down a rabbit hole. And for me, like the trick is to those little pinches of delight that I get from seeing a stat or checking to see if my direct deposit came in from work, like saving those little things for later after I've set a certain amount of words that I wrote or a certain amount of time editing. I need to use those things, those distractions as like the carrot that's dangling at
Yeah.
the end of the long journey that I have to do.
I totally get that. It's those dopamine feedback loops are so addictive, and you get them on social media, you get them on email, you get them from food, you get them from drugs and alcohol and sex, and there's a whole cadre of very well-financed corporations trying to use those to manipulate all of us. And I say that not in some conspiratorial way, but just in that, especially as an artist, you have to guard your attention, and there's so many distractions nowadays that it is hard to push all those things aside and channel that inner voice and do that work that's so important.
Absolutely. Guarding that attention is one of the hardest things, like one of the hardest battles to fight in today's day and age. But I think especially because people don't realize that it's a battle that they are in. But I think people are starting to wake up to it, and it's something we're desperately trying to figure out as quickly as possible so that we don't fall into the abyss.
Yeah.
Daniel, this has been awesome. I've loved this conversation, especially for me, selfishly. It's so nice to talk to a writer and to kind of try to tap the brain of somebody who has very effectively been able to kind of splat your own subconscious onto the page through various characters and stuff like that. But it's time for the final push, and that's where I ask you to reach through the microphone and grab the shoulder of one of the listeners that you've already really inspired today and just give them your best final words of advice and push them to pursue their own creative passions.
First, I just want to say thank you so much to you for having me here, and that you deserve so much credit for creating this type of environment where people can have these types of conversations. It's absolutely tremendous.
Oh, thank you so much.
And what I would say to anybody listening who's maybe struggling with their creative endeavor is just that you have to free yourself from any expectation of what this thing is supposed to be, where it's supposed to take you, what it's supposed to do. And just know that you're there, you're at this juncture for a reason, because you have a passion inside of you, you have a story to tell, you have a project to do. And that in and of itself is enough. It is so important. What the world needs is just really charged up, thriving, vital people who are passionate about what they're doing. And it can be so hard, I know, with all the messaging we get about the success and what success is and what achievement is. But you have to divorce yourself from that and just live in this really exciting, happy world where you are in love with the thing that you're doing. Because everybody, it seems like, some people have more to do, less to do, a more important role to play in our society or a less important role to play. And I don't believe that at all. I think that every role that every person plays is important. And that when we all follow our passions and when we do the things that really charge us up, we make the world a better place. So you're not just doing it for yourself, you're doing it for all of us. And I mean that not in a way to make it an extra burden, because I know an artist's mind can reinterpret things both ways, but as a positive, in that you're not alone. And we're all going through it together. Everybody's going through something. Nobody's life is as perfect as it seems. And nobody's life, hopefully, is as terrible as it seems either. What you're doing is important. And let that be enough to give you that motivation to keep putting in the work to get where you want to go. It doesn't matter how many times you fail, how many times you feel like you missed the mark. That's just growth. That's what growth looks like. If you want to fail, just be a spectacular failure. That's fine. Just keep failing. And then eventually you're going to figure it out. People are going to relate to what you're doing. And yeah, that's how I feel about it. That mentality is what's helped sustain me for the decade it took me to break in.
Wow, man. Really, really well said. Thank you so much for coming on the show, for sharing your journey with both television and also your new journey with your novel, which comes out tomorrow. We'll have it linked up in today's show notes page where people can get that, yourcreativepush.com/332. You can also find Daniel on Instagram at First They Ignore You. And you also said that people can email you if they want to talk to you, right?
Yeah.
And that's ftiynovel@gmail.com, correct?
Correct.
Very kind offer. And I think you will be surprised that people will take you up on that. So,
well, I look forward to hearing what they have to say.
Yes, absolutely. So if you have any questions for Daniel, reach out. Daniel, thank you so much for coming on and being so generous with your time. I really appreciate it, man.
Absolutely my pleasure.
Huge thank you to Daniel for coming on the show. One quick challenge for you at the end of this episode, based on what Daniel was talking about. Do this exercise, whether you're a writer or not. Have yourself have it out with yourself. Have that conversation or have that argument via fictional characters on paper. We've talked about it on the show before, about having a conversation with your resistance by journaling it down. But actually try to take it one step further, and instead of you having a conversation with yourself, have two fictional characters on paper having it out with each other. That might help to depersonalize it even further so that you are not actually a part of this process, if that makes sense. But create a scene in which it's different parts of your ego, different parts of your personality having it out. What does one person say to the other person about their character flaws, and what is that person's response? There's so much wisdom in finding out why you are holding yourself back, or why you're scared, or why you self-sabotage, or why you're angry all the time, or fill in the blank. But there's also so much wisdom in finding out what the response is. When you call out your resistances or whatever other things you're trying to figure out, what is the response of that other fictional character? What is the self-defense? When you can tap into that response, it will help you immensely into navigating your resistances in the future, treating them with a little bit more compassion, and therefore giving yourself a little bit more self-compassion, and then hopefully being able to bust through them. On our next episode, we have something a little bit different. Sandra and Tara of the Kickin' the Creatives podcast have tagged me in their podcast relay. So I will be presenting a solo episode to you and then tagging other podcasters for you to continue that journey. It's a really cool experiment that they're doing, and I'm so stoked to be a part of it because hopefully it will expose you to more podcasts, more creative podcasts that help to push you in your own creative pursuits. That's the whole goal of this podcast, is just to get more art out there and to help people to get to their own creative passions. I don't care if you listen to this podcast or a different one. I just want you to be exposed to what's out there. So next week I will be giving my take on how to use art to convey a message or tell a story, but you can get their take on it right away. Their episode is live right now. You can head to today's show notes page to get a link to that, yourcreativepush.com/332. And you'll also find everything we talked about today with Daniel, as well as links to get his book, which is out right now. So hopefully you are inspired to go and get your work done. So go and get it done. I love you all so much. Go get some amazing work done and guard your attention. Have a wonderful week, and we'll see you next time. Bye. Never miss a push. Head to yourcreativepush.com/subscribe to find the easiest way for you to subscribe to the podcast.